Hi, Lorna Baker here. I'm a counseling psychologist and a part of Joshua Generation. And I'd like to speak to you today about boundaries. This is part one of a two-part series, and today I'd like to look briefly at the definition of boundaries, what they are, what they look like, how they get worked out in our relationships. And then I also would like to look at a biblical understanding or some biblical language around boundaries, because I think it's important that we take psychological concepts and have a biblical understanding that they're rooted in truth. And also what some of the underlying motivations or deeper issues are regarding boundaries. And then in part two, I will look more again at how to work with some of the deeper dynamics, and then some very practical things to help people to become more healthy in having godly boundaries in their relationships. And so I want to start with two stories. One story, when my youngest daughter was about 7, she overheard Grant and myself speaking about paying some bills. And after a couple of days, she came to me. She said, "Mommy, have you paid the bills yet? Have you paid the bills yet? You've got to pay them. Have you paid them?" And I realized she had a lot of anxiety because she was taking responsibility for something that was very clearly my responsibility. So I said to her, I said, "Sweetie, you're 7 years old. I'm an adult. It's my responsibility to deal with the bills, not you." And she, at a very young age, was already crossing boundaries by taking on responsibility for something she had no need to take responsibility for, and then feeling quite anxious about that, feeling responsible for something that was clearly not her responsibility. The other story was shortly after Grant and I got married. We had our Monday off. He was in full-time ministry at the time, and we had our Monday off, and he found me answering the phone on numbers of occasions. People were calling me for counseling perspective or whatever it might be. And after getting off the phone, he said, "Lorna, you need to stop what you're doing." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" He said, "It's our day off." He said, "What you're doing is your yes to everybody with a need is a no to me. And this is our day off. And the priority right now is for us to spend time together to relax, to refresh. And you are giving yourself away to need and to people rather than setting a healthy boundary of saying no." And it was interesting. That was quite an eye-opener for me at the time. And so much of boundaries is about learning to say no so that we are available to say yes to healthy things, or to the things that God has actually called us to say yes to at given times. So let's look briefly at what boundaries are. We know that a physical boundary is a dividing line or a wall or a barrier between two properties. And so if I own a property and I have a neighbor, that boundary defines what is mine. So within my boundary, I have full authority of what goes on in my boundary and full responsibility. My neighbor has full authority and full responsibility of what goes on in his boundary, within his boundaries. He has no right to cross my boundary without me inviting him, and vice versa. And I have no right to either take responsibility or think that I have authority in terms of what goes on in his property, and vice versa. And so boundaries are a lot about authority and responsibility. So in psychological relational boundaries, we have a lot of the same qualities. Healthy personal boundaries say, this is where I begin and end, and where I end is where you begin. And it recognizes that I am fully responsible and I have authority to determine the boundaries that I have in my life, which are defined behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, values, and morals around who comes into my individual space, and whether it's emotionally or physically or relationally or sexually, and then what the rules of engagement are when someone comes into my space. So a person within their personal boundaries has full authority to set the boundary and then to determine what goes on inside, and has full responsibility. If things go sour or go south, when someone comes into our boundaries, it's my responsibility, not theirs. It's my responsibility to speak to them, address it, and get them out. And in the same way, I am not responsible for what someone else does or says or feels or believes or whatever. And I don't have any authority to step into that realm if I'm not invited. Now, with boundaries, there are healthy and unhealthy types of boundaries. And just very briefly, first of all, we have weak boundaries. And that's often what we're working with people. And with weak boundaries, very much people have a skewed sense of authority and responsibility. So with these boundaries, when they want to say yes, rather they say no, and they allow someone to come into the space. And then often we'll feel hurt or resentful or stressed because that person either came in or they weren't able to say no, and they'll blame the person. So the person gets blamed for my feelings, and the person gets blamed because I haven't set the boundary, and then I can become a victim and complain. And so with those weak boundaries, even people who are healthy can cross someone's weak boundaries and not even know it, because the person will say, sure, I would love you to come over, rather than say, actually, I'm quite busy and I don't have time for someone. And so you come over thinking you've been invited or that they want you there, and you find out that actually they're quite resentful about your coming. And you were healthy, you asked, they said yes. There's a good saying when it comes to boundaries, and that is that silence gives permission. So if a person is silent about their real need and they don't say no, then that silence or even that yes gives permission. So with weak boundaries, people often are silent or they say yes when they want to say no, and the boundaries get crossed. Also with weak boundaries is they might say no, but then a little bit of push and they give in and say yes when they still wanted to say no. And then they will blame the other person for having crossed that boundary. And so for someone with weak boundaries, also the boundaries can be inconsistent from day to day. And an example of that is for a mom with kids where, please, mommy, can I have a sweet? No, you can't have a sweet. Oh, please. Okay, you can have a sweet. The next day, no, we're not supposed to have sweets. Please, okay, I'll let you have a sweet. And then they say yes for 4 days. And then on the 5th day, it's no. But you always say yes. And the mother needs to take responsibility for the fact that she wasn't consistent in setting her boundaries. So of course they're going to keep on complaining. And so boundaries need to be consistent. And as I said, with weak boundaries, often things get mixed up. Rather than taking responsibility for their decisions and their feelings, they put the responsibility on the other person for the violation of boundaries and then how they feel. And often also with weak boundaries, if we do say no and the person gets angry, then we take responsibility for the person's feelings. Whereas they chose to be angry, they could have said, okay, so they take responsibility for the person's feelings, and but they don't take responsibility they don't stand in the responsibility of having said, look, I did say no, so if they're angry, too bad. And so it gets mixed up. The second kind of boundary is a rigid boundary. And I just comment on that's a very strong, inflexible boundary where someone everything is no and they don't want anyone close. It's generally because they have had weak boundaries and now it's a reaction of having a really high, impenetrable boundaries. And we have to work with someone like that. But then healthy boundaries can be very strong and flexible. And someone with healthy boundaries has a good sense of themselves. So they can say yes if they want someone in, and they take responsibility for it. But they can also say no, even at risk of somebody not understanding. And so they don't need to please the person, don't need to please. And so they're able to be true to what they feel they need to say, whether it's yes or no. And if someone pushes those boundaries, is aggressive or unhealthy, they can easily strengthen the boundaries and say, I said no, you are not coming in. And at some points, you actually have to remove yourself from a person, but you don't mind doing that. So if people are acting unhealthy when they have been let in, then that person can recognize that, take responsibility for the fact, now I'm feeling resentful or I'm feeling hurt, and address the person, talk to them about it, and say that isn't okay, and remove them from the boundaries. And so with a healthy boundary, if someone comes in and is unhealthy, I don't take responsibility for that person. I take responsibility for the fact that I let them in, and I take responsibility for getting them out. But I let them take responsibility for the bad attitude, the bad behavior, whatever it might be. And with healthy boundaries as well, they can remain flexible. So one time I may, for instance, if I take a Monday off, I may say no, 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 and people respect that, but there may be times where I do need to say yes for the sake of others or for the sake of some important incident, so I can remain flexible in that. There are two biblical principles that I would like to look at particularly generally in terms of what it means to live with healthy boundaries. The first one is that when we decide what we say yes to and what we say no to, on what authority or how do we decide that? So, and Jesus said in John, he said, he gave them this answer, "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does." Jesus, in justifying or in explaining how he chose to do things, because he didn't always heal when people wanted to be healed. He didn't always, he didn't appease the desires of man. He was not a people pleaser. What he did was he chose to do what the Father was doing. So what that meant was to say yes to the Father. He would say no to men. And so the fear of the Lord and the desire to obey and to please the Lord was the driving force behind how he worked with people. So he did not say yes when he wanted to say no because somebody had a need. He said yes because the Father was saying yes. And he would say no if he felt the Father saying no. And for me, that is a fundamental reality and a fundamental principle that we live out of that actually solves so many of the problems around boundaries. Because who are we trying to please? When I'm struggling, when someone has asked me to do something and I'm struggling, do I say yes or do I say no? What is the motive? So a lot of people are praised for being such servants. You always say yes, you're always there. And it looks like such a positive thing. But see, God is interested in the motive of the heart. And oftentimes those wonderful yeses and that wonderful service is because they actually can't say no. And so unfortunately, we often hear that in the church, the busiest servants are the ones who are given even more things because they will say yes. And often if you talk to them, they're harried and tired and stressed and strained and feel like they're the ones who are doing a lot of the work. And a lot of it is because they don't know how to say no. They feel guilty if they do say no. They feel obliged to say yes. They see the need. And so the need is greater than the desire or the need to do some other things. And like I said earlier, whenever we say yes to one thing, we are saying no to something else because we only have 24 hours a day. And sometimes our yeses are done for the wrong reasons and they're not actually honoring to the Lord, even if they're works of service in the church. And so we've got to be able to hear the voice of the Father. Jesus did not go by what religious people wanted from him. He only did what the Father said to do. And so if he said no, it was to say yes to the Lord. If he said yes, it wasn't to please the people still. It was to say yes to the Lord. And so we are to live the same way. And I think of the two scriptures that say that it is without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so when we are saying our yeses or are we saying our nos, are we doing them out of guilt or the fear of man or the fear of rejection, or maybe people won't understand, or well, the need is there and I can do it. I'm not doing anything else that particular night. So why not say yes? Are we doing it out of those motivations, or are we doing them out of the motivation, God, I have faith for this, and I know that this is something you want me to put my hand to, so my yes is my yes. The other scripture, of course, is that without faith, it is impossible to please God, and that nothing that is done, unless it is done, anything that is not done by faith is sin. And so the same thing, are we saying yes? So when somebody is struggling to say no to somebody, now it may seem a small thing, but if they are not doing it out of faith and they're doing it out of any other motivation, it's actually sin. That's what the Bible says. And people pleasing, in Proverbs it talks about that man pleasing is a snare. The pursuing the pleasure of man or the approval of men is a snare. And people who struggle to say no in given situations are in bondage to the fear of man. And it is sinful. We don't want to call it that because we think, they're wounded and they're struggling. Yes, they are. And oftentimes there's a very low sense of self and a lack of confidence. And it's like they're looking for other people to validate them. But we are to live out of the fear of God and out of the pleasure of God, not the fear of man. And so we have, even as a church, we have approved of and given praise to people who say yes, 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 when a lot of their yeses are going to be dead works that get burned up and are nothing to, and we've got to help people to learn to let their no be a no so that they can say yes to the Lord. So that's the first thing, is there's an active obedience that we need to see, that our ability to stand our ground in something and not be able to stand against it and to feel like we've got to give in to the pleasure of man is actually a sinful pattern in our lives that needs to be broken, but has been approved in many ways. And you can see the fruit of it is death. The fruit of it is resentment and anxiety and stress and being overly tired and burned out, and then judgment on other people for abusing us or for not treating us fairly, when in fact they asked and we had an opportunity to say no, but we didn't want to risk the rejection, so we said yes. So very important that we address that with people. May I just add as well that when we people please rather than obey the Lord, it's a form of idolatry. Because whoever we obey and whoever we try to please is the one that we put on a pedestal, and we look to that person or group of people or the Lord for approval, for acceptance, for a sense of well-being. And so a lot of our lack of being able to set boundaries with people and say no is because there's an idolatry in our heart towards people, out of people pleasing, as opposed to honoring the Lord. And so we really, again, from a biblical perspective, we need to recognize that these things are not just psychological things that we're doing. Underlying it is a depth of bentness away from being true to our walk with God, because we're bending into the pleasure of man. It's very, very important that we address that lovingly and with compassion, with understanding, but it is sinful, and it causes so much conflict and damage in relationships on all levels. So the loving thing is to help people to recognize this and do something about it. Can I also say that there is in service, and when we do serve, when we do say yes, 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 there is a yes, and there is a service that is a real sacrifice, but that is a joy to the Lord because it's coming out of obedience. And so in obedience to the Lord, there's life that comes out of our service, even if it's difficult and stressful at times because there's a lot of it. But when we know that it's out of obedience to God, there's a life and a joy that comes with the service that is very different than when we are pleasing people out of the fear of rejection or the fear of disapproval by saying yes all the time. And so it can be the very same actions, but one of them has life and the other one has death. And so we want to help people to come into a place where their service is out of, not just their service, but they're relating healthily with people is out of obedience to the Lord, because in that place there'll be real life for them. The other biblical principle that I wanted to highlight was that of honesty and truth. And one of the problems with the difficulties that people have in saying no is that there's an incredible amount of emotional dishonesty that runs rampant in our relationships. It runs rampant often in our marriages, where we aren't honest with one another around our real needs or our desires or what we're thinking or what we're doing. It runs rampant in our friendships. It runs rampant in our work environments, where we can't speak forthrightly because of the concern of consequence. But the consequence of the dishonesty and the lack of boundaries ends up making us sick out of obligation and resentment and bitterness and judgment against others for how they're treating us, and also disappointment in ourselves, that we can't stand up for ourselves in a sense. And so the other side of it is that let your yes be yes and your no be no, and speak truthfully to one another. Do not lie to one another, but speak truthfully. And so the Bible speaks about us not lying to one another. And emotional dishonesty is a form of lying. So when I say yes, 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 like I'm in full agreement, and yet inside I'm saying no, 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 we are not being truthful. And so we need to learn to risk walking in the light with one another. And again, kindly, authentically, vulnerably, but truthfully. And bear the consequence, because the consequence of truth done in love actually will create a deeper respect and a deeper intimacy between people than the dishonesty that we get into when we don't want to say no. And we see this on all kinds of levels. We see this in people with their leaders. We see this in our communities. We see it in friendships, in work environments, and on every level. And it's a devastating thing to see somebody caught up in an absolute inability to say no, and then caught between feeling responsible for other people and how they're doing and what they're feeling and what they're thinking about them, but not actually taking responsibility for what we're doing and our ability to change. And so we really need to work with people around honesty. And I've seen numbers of situations, not so much in the church, in the world, but where marriages, where a wife has been emotionally dishonest, wouldn't set boundaries, would say yes, 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 please, 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 and not be honest. And eventually, but never spoke it out. So the boundaries were crossed over and over and over again. The husband wasn't necessarily even aware of it. Then one day said, you know what? I'm not in love with you anymore. This marriage has always been about you, not about me. You've never been concerned about my needs, and that's it. I'm leaving. And he's going, what? Like, where did this come from? I didn't even know that you felt that way. And so, again, silence gives permission. So if I am silent when I'm not happy about something, I'm expecting the other person to read my mind and know that. They won't know it unless I communicate it to them kindly, lovingly, honestly, and assertively. And then work it out relationally. And I think because, as well, often people will say, well, I tried to work out the conflict, but it didn't work. They didn't hear. And sometimes our attempts to set the boundary and speak the truth is very tentative and not really clear. And so the person hasn't heard. And sometimes we need to draw that line firmer and firmer until they have. And I think we also need to help people understand that if they're not able to set certain boundaries, sometimes they have to ask for help to learn to do it with somebody, or to learn how to do it, because it's a skill that must be developed in order to be able to have good, honest, healthy relationships with other people. And so these are things that I see biblically, that there's a lot of room biblically for us to work with boundaries with people. So I'm going to close at that, and we will pick up more about boundaries in part 2. And I hope that that's been helpful for you. Thank you.